I'm Brad Warren. I ran fishing magazines for a long time, and about 25 years ago, we started a think tank to work on the big problems threatening fisheries. And they're usually big, common resource management problems, like we don't know how to make sure we get rid of bycatch, and we don't know, it's all these problems. And they're all big. And the biggest of them all, it turned out, was what carbon pollution does to the ocean. This is about whether the ocean can still make fish. So we built a program which has been running for 12 years, working on this. And I'm gonna hand the mic now to Julia Sanders, who's our deputy director, and who'll walk you through some of the symptoms that we're seeing, and maybe you're seeing. And in fact, it'd be a good thing to talk a little about that when we get to it. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for all of you for being here. We really appreciate it. So as Brad said, Global Ocean Health was founded and led by people that have a background in the commercial fishing industry, and we like to feel that that gives us a little bit more of an understanding of the issues that really matter in fishing families, coastal communities, and we were also very much focused on the impacts of ocean acidification when the oyster hatcheries were hit around 2008, 2009. We raised some critical money to make sure that they were able to get monitoring programs so that their water was buffered, and we were able to avoid losing that very important economic foothold in our states. So these are some of the headlines that came back then. Oysters in deep trouble, a warning from the sea. Really, no one had expected this for decades, and no one understood what was going on. Things happen in oyster farming all the time, viruses, bacteria, and so for a long time people were mystified, and then they realized it's carbon dioxide. It's mixing with the water, it's being absorbed from the atmosphere, and it is causing these shells to dissolve. This is the image that we helped fund in partnership with Oregon State University, and it shows what happened to a very young oyster larvae as it was exposed to acidified water in the first 2 days of its life, or 4 days of its life, excuse me. So you can see how under ordinary circumstances it's got that beautiful round smooth shell, and under acidified conditions it's totally misshapen. Now this image became the aha image that was used by Senate, many politicians, just to shine a light on this problem and to gain critical funding to ensure that this problem would be addressed. So what's at stake? I think all of you know, hundreds of billions of dollars worldwide, and it's not just about the dollars, although these are the things that motivate politicians and are certainly important, but it's also because of all of you being here at Fisher Poets. I know that you realize that it's about the lifestyle as well, and what fishing means to people, what the ocean means to people, and that there's a whole way of life and a way of community that is at stake here as well. So, to talk about some of the other carbon threats to fisheries, I've already discussed ocean acidification, but we've also had a huge problem with warming. I'm sure some of you heard about the warm blob that hit us around 2015, where you had salmon dying by the 500,000 in the Columbia River. And warming also causes these unprecedented harmful algal blooms that shut down the Dungeness crab fisheries, that shut down razor clam fisheries. Razor clam are a sustaining piece of the economy of many of our coastal communities and businesses. Just one shutdown of razor clams for a season mean businesses close on our coast. We can't afford to have that happen. And then hypoxia. As these algal blooms happen, they suck up all the oxygen out of the water, and you get these fish kills. And all of these things often combine to work together. That's what you call multiple stressors, is when you have warming and you have acidification. So for example, with harmful algal blooms, Pseudonychia, the one that causes most of these shutdowns that we've talked about, we've shown now through scientific research that when it is exposed to high carbon ocean water, it becomes more toxic. So not only is it out there releasing the toxin, but it's an even more harmful toxin because of the presence of carbon in the water. Scary stuff. So these are some of the headlines related to warming. Some of these will make your toes curl. West rivers are hot enough to cook salmon to death. Acidic oceans and warm rivers that kill Idaho salmon might be the norm in 50 years. Marine animal deaths attributed to low oxygen levels. Scary stuff. And these are all in the last couple years. And to mention that the blob looked like it was going away, to temperatures were returning not quite to normal, but a little bit less harmful. And now we're getting, again, these marine heat waves that are becoming the norm. And we're seeing temperatures that are just unprecedented, and it looks like that will be continue to be the case, as it is on land, where we're seeing, again, every month is a record month in the history of recorded temperatures. So the food web is unraveling as part of this. So when there's warm water, there's a type of zooplankton called copepods, and there's warm water copepods and cold water copepods. And warm water ones, they float around and they don't carry much in the way of fat. They don't have many lipids because they're able to get what the energy source that they need from the feeding that they do normally. Whereas the cold water ones, they store more fat, so they have more energy. And this is the very base of the food chain. So because the water's warming, they show right here that collected off Oregon, we're getting these warm water copepods. Now, everything that feeds off of these isn't getting the energy levels because they don't have the fat levels in the copepods that they need. So that's the forage fish that are feeding on these copepods, and then the salmon feed on the forage fish, and the southern resident killer whales feed on the salmon. And you see this whole unraveling of the food chain coming from the base because of this warming. So what's visible versus what's world changing? Everybody hears about plastic in the ocean. Yes, it's horrifying. 4.8 to 12.7 million tons of plastic entered the ocean in 2010. However, 32 billion metric tons of CO2 was released in the atmosphere in 2015. And we know that a quarter to a third of all carbon dioxide is absorbed by the ocean. So that means that at least 8 billion tons of that carbon dioxide was absorbed by the ocean. So that's an entire order of magnitude larger. We're talking about a billion, yes, excuse me, billion tons instead of a million tons. But carbon dioxide isn't visible in the way that plastic is. And so you see a lot of news stories about plastic. People are very concerned about it. But if you could see carbon dioxide, and when you think about the levels that are being consumed by the ocean, that's when you realize this is what's really world-changing. This is what's really causing these problems. So, in response to this, we worked with the Northwest Salmon Canners Association originally. They came to us and said, what can we do to get involved with this problem? How can we help? And so we formed the Working Group on Seafood and Energy, which is an association of coastal communities, tribes, and pretty much anyone whose livelihood depends on fishing, to come together and understand the problem, be able to be advocates and speak knowledgeably about these problems that are affecting their livelihoods, and identify solutions. So example, different opportunities to affect carbon emissions, and wherever possible to make recommendations about policies that are under review to make sure that they work for people that live in coastal communities, for rural people, that we're not just creating solutions that are only right for metro areas that can easily electrify, that people that have to drive trucks for a living or drive diesel engines because there isn't an electric option, that these solutions can still work for them, that they can be part of the solution, but still be a huge part of reducing these carbon emissions. So why does this matter so much? Well, it matters when the people who actually do the work come to talk. So many times when I talk to people, they'll say, okay, this is great, but we need to hear from the people who are actually out there on the water, the people that make this money, people that are a part of this economy, because their voices matter. So when politicians hear from an NGO or some Seattle liberal, it counts for about this much compared to someone who's actually out there on the water and who is responsible for these billions of dollars in economic activity, that's what matters. When they come up and testify and say, this is an issue that I care about, this is an issue that I'm experiencing, and I want you to do it. I'm one of your constituents, and I care, and I expect you to address this problem. That's what matters, and I hear that over and over again, and we've seen the results of it over and over again when we've brought fishermen to testify before Senate, for example. It made all the difference for the people that are actually involved to be giving this testimony. And part of the way that you can do that is through op-eds. So that's something that we help people. We'll work with you to create it. If you're not comfortable with writing, we can sit down with you and help you develop something that can be either in your local newspaper, the Daily Historian, or in seafood.com, anywhere that we can get the message out and let your peers know that this is something that's happening, that's real, that you care about, and it will also get the notice of those who are decision makers in power. So I will pass around this sign-up sheet. Now, your email will just get you signed up for our regular newsletter, which is quarterly and gives you news about ocean acidification and other threats related to carbon pollution. And then there's a thing at the end, if you're interested in being part of the working group, that just means that you'll get a monthly email that lets you know about what policies are coming up and how you can be involved in signing on to a comment letter, creating an op-ed, or just knowing what policies are available and opportunities to comment. So I'll pass this around, and I will turn it over. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, and you'll find in the ocean acidification report, if you start getting it, there's also stuff in there about solutions, which we have found is kind of important. This is the kind of information that it breaks your heart. And if you don't know what you can do about it, and you don't have an idea how to make a difference, it's just too painful. People just go into their shells and don't come back out. So we spend a lot of time looking at what can ordinary people do, what can policies do. You know, this is one of the big problems in the way we approach problems this big, is that we think, I need to solve this by my actions. Actually, your actions matter. But this is made by all of us together, and it's by all of us acting together that we solve it. We made this mess together. Together we're going to wind up solving it somehow. And we think that's actually true for a bunch of reasons that are hard to believe right now in this time when it seems so impossible that people can do anything together. But there's a lot to it. There's an awful lot of good work going on. So in Washington, as in Oregon, and after I'm done, you'll hear a little bit from Dan about some policies pending in Oregon. I'll take a quick walk through. I'm not going to go into detail about these. The big news is that the largest piece of emissions in our society comes from transportation. It's all of us driving around in our cars mostly. It's the trucks that bring our food. It's the trains. It's the ships. As you can see, it's almost half. This half that sort of looms up to the left is from transportation. It's also where the rubber hits the road in a really hard way. You know, it's one thing to say we're going to make big industrial polluters pay. Everybody likes that idea. But if you're going to make me pay at the gas tank, suddenly I'm worried about going broke. And the policies, what we found is that you have to give people on the ground a chance to get their voice into it, to shape something they can live with. So in other words, a good policy helps people become the solution. A bad policy just hits you over the head with a 2x4 and says, now behave. You know, there's a big difference. There's a huge difference in efficacy. The ones that help you become the solution actually. So the big thing that's changed from 2 years ago, and this is really a big deal. 2 years ago, British Petroleum spent about $13 million fighting an initiative in Washington State that we put a lot of effort into helping to improve and make it actually pretty decent. And it was called Initiative 1631, and it was going to put a price on carbon and then use the money to help people become the solution. The obstacle to solving this problem is almost always that you don't have the money to invest in the cleaner whatever it is. And you know, in a society with the vast wealth inequalities we have, large numbers of Americans do not have the option to behave as intended when all you do is whack them over the head with a higher price. If you actually want them to be able to solve things, you got to help them. So 2 years ago, a policy that did this, BP and other oil companies fought it. They fought very well. They clobbered us. They cleaned our clocks. Now, this year, BP is coming out in support of a very, very similar policy. The differences are, you know, are like moving the rice grains on the table. This is the same thing. And I'll go into why a little bit later if there's time. Having spent all that money now, they're backing it. This is BP's corporate pledge worldwide. They're going to go carbon neutral by 2050. One can believe them or not. Still, they're doing some things that give us reasons, and there are things happening to them that give us reason to think we might actually want to take this seriously, even if we keep our eyes open for the chance that they don't mean it. The big thing, and I didn't have time to make a slide about this, is that the world is changing out from under them. They live in a beautiful fortress called dependence on fossil fuels. And our society is breaking that fortress, and there's nothing they can do about it. They are having to adapt. So they are, if you look at what their main customer base is us driving cars and trucks. And the people who build those cars and trucks are investing not PR money, but billions of dollars to retool their manufacturing facilities and make electric vehicles. The engine manufacturers are doing this. The ones who can't go electric are going into cleaner fuels. These things are dramatic changes in the market that was impregnable for them. Oil occupied a truly moated market that nobody else could contend with them for. And that's been, that's blowing up as we speak because the bomb went off inside the fortress. It was their own big industrial customers, the people who make vehicles, who are spending billions to retool what they build to use a lot less fuel. And frankly, to be more reliable, to be more powerful, to require less maintenance, to be cheaper, but to operate by a factor of between 4 and 10. I mean, this is, we'll get into all this down the road. Now, this workshop is not about electrification, but it's part of a suite of technologies that are really taking the ball away from these guys. They can't play the way they used to. So they're making radical adaptive moves. And it's actually a great time to be negotiating with them because for once, they don't have all the cards. They just quit their lobby groups, another thing that indicates they might mean it. The lobby groups are taking positions that oppose the policies they're supporting. Same thing from the Anchorage Daily News. Now, these are bills, actually they're backing both. The one that they're backing hard and heavy is the Cap and Invest. There are two in Washington State. These are both basically, to be a little reductive, a Cap and Invest takes the whole economy's carbon and puts a price on it and then invests the money to help people afford to become a solution. That's what a good design should try to do. Some do it better than others. It gets at the whole problem and it gets it in a way that has some advantages because you can get everybody moving together and get a lot of synergies from that movement. If you look at a low carbon fuel standard, it does the same basic thing, in a slightly more convoluted way. And it targets just transportation fuels. And a lot of the environmental community has been very interested in moving a bill to do that. We've been neutral on it. We can't determine how effective, how cost effective, or what it will cost. We have not been able to nail down whether this is a genuinely useful move or a feel-good move. It could be either or even both. But at the best it can be is not as good as what you can get if you get a holistic cap and trade or cap and invest system, either one. It doesn't matter whether you trade the permits or you have a tax. Either way, what you're really doing is you're raising money. What matters then is what you do with it. Do you use it to actually drive all of the increased productivity and the savings that allow people to live with a price without getting whacked by it? If you don't have to buy as much fuel because you get your work done, you get less fuel, this doesn't cost you anything. If you're able to increase your fuel efficiency across your whole life, from your house to your car to your airplane travel, whatever, you actually can come out ahead in a well-designed policy. Our function in working with folks in the working group on seafood and energy is to help folks on the waterfront figure out what's going to happen for us to be able to live with this. I mean, it's a long time before we're going to be able to turn off the diesel spigot on boats that run into Alaska. Those boats, however, do have a lot of efficiency options, and those cost money. And they're actually quite cost-effective investments. You drive in efficiency in a boat's fuel consumption, and you're going to save money. We'll get into all that in later conversations. We've dealt with some of that before. I'm not going to go into detail now. But those are the two policies pending in Washington. We don't think either one's going to pass this year. There's a short season in the legislature. We think that the Cap and Invest program will come back in 2021. And we've got a few months to get our oar in the water and shape it so that it actually works for people who work on the water. And that's what we'll be doing. And here we transition to Dan, who's going to talk about what's going on in Oregon.
So, thanks. I'm Dan Mahon. I've been volunteering with Global Ocean Health, doing Oregon policy work. He calls me a policy analyst. I can be executive director if I take less money, whatever. But this is from a 1960 cartoon by Charles Adams, and Statue of Liberty. But anyway, it's just a little scare picture about rising sea levels. But I wanted to go a little bit differently than Brad did, even though the policy stuff in Oregon and Washington is nearly the same. Just that Oregon's annual emissions, 6.4 billion gallons of diesel equivalent. So it's a big number. And Brad mentioned the theory of cap and trade, and cap and invest. So the Oregon stuff, compared to Washington, Oregon already has a clean fuels program. That was passed several years ago, but it's just now being implemented. I'm not going to talk about it, but we did do that. Oregon's emissions, basic deal is the yellow line is the one you want, and the real line is, hey, emissions are still too high and going up. So this is the reason for doing something. And just like Washington, the green area, transportation, is the largest share of the emissions, then electricity, then burning natural gas. It's the way the Oregon scene stacks up. It's very related to population too. If you look at the Washington numbers, it's just bigger than this because there are more people in Washington.
So the 30% in the electricity is from the coal plants and stuff?
Coal and natural gas, yeah. And so in Oregon's case, that means it's for electricity for metropolitan Portland, and people served by the private utilities, whereas me, who's served by a municipal utility, uses Bonneville power, which is what most of rural Oregon is served by.
That's a 2012
Yeah, it hasn't changed
Yeah,
much.
Okay.
It's relatively static.
Mhm.
Is forestry under the other?
Forestry is in agriculture in this diagram. But one of the key things is I have these high-tech presentation tools. So the forestry part does not, this bill is about reducing emissions from burning fossil fuels. And it has nothing to do with burning wood, making wood products, harvesting wood, making paper, any of that. It's only about burning fossil fuels. That's been, in terms of the political debate, one of the things that's gotten mixed up is this bill has never been about so-called biogenic emissions, just fossil fuels. Anyway, this was one of the modifications to the measure. As Brad mentioned, the issue about fuel prices is just a killer. And so what's been proposed as a compromise in the measure that has caused the exodus of Oregon's Republicans is that they phased in the applicability of the fees to fuels, eliminating East Oregon from the program altogether and making it so that most of the rest of the state came on in 2028.
So that means you only have to pay if you live in Portland?
Yes, at the beginning. Portland Metro, the 3 counties in Portland.
Or fueled up there.
Hmm?
Fueled up there.
Yes, with one very funny legislative thing, which is a carve-out for the Jubitz truck stop, and the way that was written was really funny to read in terms of language. The bill, and the summary I'm giving is pretty gross. The bill is nearly 100 pages long, so I'm just hitting some of the. In terms of electric, basically the plan says electric utilities. We're not going to do anything with you other than that you could raise your rates some under regulation, and everybody expects that the electric utility will be off of fossil fuels within 10 years. And there's a decent chance they're going to get there anyway, because in the electric space, renewable sources of electricity are the cheapest form of electricity right now. So it's a relatively easy thing for them to accomplish. So electric is easy. In the natural gas space, they're saying, okay, we're going to charge you for these allowances, and your gas rates will go up some. Low-income people are protected from those rate increases. They did carve out for critical, politically important, large businesses. Not completely, but somewhat. And most of the funds in the program wind up being used for conservation. This is a core part of Northwest Natural Gas's strategy to reduce their carbon footprint, is to help their customers use less gas. Then about some of the money is removed from the natural gas scene and is taken into the program to be used for other activities under the bill. Industry, I think, is quite interesting the way it was handled. While they made it largely exempt from the fees, it sets up a standard that says if you're a business and you meet the standards for that business for being as efficient as you can in the use of fuels, you don't have to pay very much. But if you start sliding behind and you're not implementing the most efficient technology, then you're going to pay more in fees. It's a very interesting approach to the problem. The fees that they might charge go back to a loan program, back to the industries to help them lower their emissions. Anyway, in Oregon, transportation taxes or any fee put on transportation has to be used for a highway purpose. And this creates great limitations on policymakers and what they can do, because as Brad mentioned, you can't, the idea of helping people make a transition is you really can't use the money for that. So that's one of the key problems or limitations. Now, this part, as Brad would say, their working group has not taken a position on the Oregon bill. But using his principles, I've given it some grades here. So I think that the electric part is great. I think it there's a good policy mechanism, it all looks good, and I think that the electrical space is gonna get off of fossil fuels. Natural gas is pretty good. There's a lot of conservation stuff, and editorial on my part, but Northwest Natural Gas as a gas utility is a pretty good outfit in terms of thinking about the future. I give industrial emissions an A because I think the approach the legislature took is very innovative and hasn't been tried anywhere else, and takes a real light, doesn't put a lot of cost on industry, but it does give them some incentives to do the right thing. On vehicle fuels, you know, I give it an F because we're unable, or it's difficult to come up with a way to provide incentives to people to conserve or invest in new technology, given what Oregon's Constitution says. I do think that it's significantly better than it was due to the phase-in that the legislature came up with. But this is the source of the primary political problem with the bill. And overall, I give it this thing a B. So with that, I'll be quiet. If anybody has any questions, there are millions of them out there about this thing. Okay.
Well, I have a comment that I am kind of lonely in. I have a guy from 350 that lives 2 houses down for he runs 350 for Portland. But everybody's looking at one thing, and I worked with colleges way back when, and I know how people get focused on where the data is explicit. And I looked at the satellite data for determining CO2 load from forest fires and from forests. And the pixels are, the smallest ones that I saw were 500 meters by 500 meters. Some are 1 kilometer in size. And they're determining so-called the load from forest fires, which is huge, and we will have more. And my concern is because we can't measure it, we don't feel that it's real. And so I would like to invite you as a policy investigator to look at biochar, which is a very low-tech way that the pre-Columbian Indians put their garbage in 6-foot trenches and burned it with banana leaves over it, and did a whole lot for effect.
You're right. There are ways of managing land use that improve its ability to capture and retain carbon, and that diminish the risk of forest fires. And part of what went into the design of 1631 in 2018 and got embraced in the bill that BP is now backing in Olympia is a measure that recognizes some of that and tries to put some of the money into practices that improve that. It's a big question how much of it there is. The measurements are hard, but there's enough to be worth doing. And so you're making a good point. We got to move on, so we'll come back to this.
That's also true in Oregon. And there is language and there are money set aside for doing some work in that space.
Can I just jump one more sentence in here?
Okay.
I would like to see municipalities deal with that with school children, which is cleaning up the waste stream, putting precious kids in that and learning it because it's low tech.
Yeah.
It's simple.
And the hardest part, we've done some work looking at that, and how to set up programs for kids, doing simple measurements that make a difference. And it's hard to get verified measurements. It's so costly and so uncertain. So it is a measurement problem. You pegged it with that first comment. It makes it very difficult to know that you're hitting the nail on the head. That this category of activity matters, yes. how to measure it is so hard. Yes?
Quick question just about both the bills. In your experiences or being engaged in the bill in Oregon and in Washington, how often are ocean impacts even sort of mentioned as a justification for reducing emissions and the further need for this type of legislation, or is it pretty absent from that discussion in either state?
It's gone from utterly absent to being occasionally part of the conversation. I think it was only about 2-3 years ago that the UN, in its IPCC and international climate negotiations, started recognizing the ocean as part of what you got to be thinking about in doing climate risk evaluations and that kind of thing. In Oregon, in Washington, in Maine, in California, in a number of coastal states and coastal nations, actually, Mexico, Chile, I could go on. Much of the Mediterranean basin, Norway, Iceland. There are a number of countries that have begun to take this pretty seriously as an ocean issue. There's coming up in June, I think, is a world ocean kind of climate confab, it's getting more and more attention than it should. I mean, the ocean is 90% of the global heat sink. It absorbs 90% of the heat. It's about 90% of the biosphere. It's where most things that are alive live. Depending on the time scale you're looking at, it absorbs an awful lot of the carbon that naturally cycles in the world, and the carbon that we dig out of the ground, loft into the sky, and hope something good happens to it. In fact, you're going to hear. I'm going to advance this because I'm going to close out with a little comment here. You're going to hear a lot about this term carbon removal. We're down to brass nuts now, brass tacks. The human race has blown past the limit where we could once have solved this problem just by reducing emissions. The scientific papers that have come out in the last few years have made it very clear we can't do that and expect to solve it anymore. We actually need to actively grab it out of the air and the water and put it somewhere where it stays. And this is actually a really interesting dilemma to be in, because it calls on this combination of desperation and ingenuity that people are way better at. Put that combination together, and people are way smarter than they are when they can't really see it coming and it's invisible and you know, maybe it's not even real. We're over all that. You know, there's a few denialists left, but we're over that. And we're into this era where people are doing very, very inventive things to remove it, and sometimes make new things out of it, sometimes stick it in rock and let it stay back where it started out. You'll hear a lot more about that. You'll hear a lot from us about it. It's a very important new field. It will be moving. Worldwide, we got about 40 billion tons of CO2 going into the atmosphere now. It's gone up since that number that Julia cited earlier, when it was 32. It's now closer to 40, a little higher. 40 billion tons a year. At least 10 of that is now projected to wind up getting hoovered out annually of the air and put somewhere. If you think about that one for a minute, this is a big issue for coastal communities and the ocean, because the place that's most likely to get put is in your backyard. And how it gets put there really matters. If they do this wrong, they break the ocean. If they do it right, it could be a really good thing. And the distinctions are the subject of a big piece of work that we're gearing up for now in collaboration with research institutions and on and on. And you know, honestly, we think if this is going to be done right, the people on the waterfront who depend on a healthy ocean should own it. You don't want to be the one showing up with a placard saying, I don't like what you're doing. You want to be the one in the boardroom saying, I own what you're doing, and you're going to do it right. That's the conversation we are hoping to stimulate. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic back to Julia, and she'll close with our usual rah-rah, and I hope that I hope this has been helpful. And she will also plant a question. If any of you have had observations, your own direct observations, about what you're seeing changing in the ocean, we want to hear about it.
Well, I don't know that I really need to plant the question anymore. But if you've seen any observations of your own that you believe are relevant to these issues, we would love to hear about it, and I've got cards here. I also wanted to note something that I wanted to look up the exact number before I spoke earlier. That research last year showed that the amount of heat released or absorbed by the ocean in 2018 was the equivalent of 150 million Hiroshima-sized bombs, and that 2018 was the warmest ocean year on record since we started taking annual temperature records in the 1950s. And the next hottest years were 2017, 2016, 2015, and 2014. And another way to reckon the Hiroshima bit is it's about 1.5 Hiroshima-sized bombs every second. So it's really just these mind-numbingly huge amounts of energy that are of heat that are being absorbed. And so it's no wonder that we see these cascading effects, and we're seeing creatures showing up in the north that were never meant to be here. And so everything is changing, and we're going to continue to see that. I'm sure many of you do have stories to tell us about pulling up sunfish or Pacific pompano or things that you've never seen before off our coast or even farther north. So from there, I will point out that we are a nonprofit, and we rely on donations for much of our work. Brad and I donate a lot of our time, but any support that people are able to give really makes a huge difference in our ability to act when it's needed, to jump on problems as they come up and make sure that we can be here at events like this and hundreds of other presentations that we drive hours and hours to go and give 20 minutes to speak to people and let them know about these issues and try to spread the word, and hundreds of hours examining these policies and trying to find solutions that will work for everyone, writing politicians, composing these op-eds and comment letters. All of these things can be supported by a donation of any size. And we can accept credit cards. We also have a big seafood benefit in May in Seattle aboard a Deadliest Catch crabber, and we would welcome you to take a card for more information on that. And we also look for volunteers, or if you have something that you think would be great for our silent auction, we would welcome that. Any of you can take one of these great stickers from over here and help yourself to a blueberry muffin. Help us get rid of those as well. But anyone that donates will get these awesome bumper stickers. So I don't know if everyone realizes that the ocean is responsible for half of the oxygen that we breathe. That all of that plankton that photosynthesizes in the ocean, that's why we can take a breath every second. And so this sticker will let you educate the world about just another piece of how important the ocean is. I think we're wrapping up a little early, but we would still welcome other questions.
I got a question, actually, not a personal observation, but I'm recently kind of aware of some of the role that kelp and seaweed provide as a forest of carbon capture.
Absolutely.
I know if you have any additional information about it.
Well, I will add that the important thing is that the kelp be harvested if you really want to capture that carbon, because otherwise it can decay and re-release that carbon and nitrogen. But it's true that kelp has many, many benefits, including carbon sequestration, and is actively being used as a way to mitigate ocean acidification. And it not only does that, but it prevents storm surge, helps with wave energy, and it provides incredible habitat for fish and crabs, and we are losing an enormous amount of it.
Are there programs that you know of that are moving the other way, trying to utilize kelp?
Many. So there's a big project up in Puget Sound that is looking at just how much it does change the chemistry in a little localized halo area, and they are actively trying to find means to then transform that kelp once it's harvested. The first year, I believe it went to a farmer, but there are many, many uses for kelp between medicine, food, and many other options. And it's one of the most active fields of research in ocean acidification.
We actually
mitigation.
wrote the recommendation that became the template for how states encourage this activity back 7 years ago, when it became clear that we were going to need to develop the photosynthetic potential of the coastal near shore, which you have this gorgeous green ribbon around the continents that does about as much sequestration work as all the world's forests.
Of course, you're probably
In
aware
about 2% of the land area.
this green circle around the earth interrupts when it comes to Oregon because of active desertification of happening out there off the Oregon coast.
Yeah, could
What's
you
being done
explain
about that?
what's happening from California on up with the kelp and the sea urchins, so forth?
Yeah, so
Good stuff.
since the sea urchin, sea star wasting disease happened around 2014, 2015, which was linked to the blob, but we're not sure exactly how. We've had just this extreme die-off of sea stars, and they are the main predators for purple urchins. The purple urchins, unlike other urchins, have no value as food or much of anything else, but they can live to on the brink of starvation, and they love kelp, and so without their natural main predator, they have completely overtaken our kelp forests from Northern California to Oregon, and just any time a little nub of kelp grows, they're on it. And so you have just these wastelands that used to be incredible kelp forests, just, full of life, that are now just muddy flats full of spiny purple urchins. And they're incredibly hard to get rid of. They have divers going down there with vacuum tubes. They've got bounties on them, but they're very, very difficult to catch. And like I said, they can live on the edge of starvation for a long time. So it's
So they're hard to start out.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the only other predators that they have are, as I understand it, seals, things like that. But they're not able to do the job that the sea stars did. The sea stars are not bouncing back. So something we're looking at is ways to help plant and restore. But without a good solution for controlling the urchins, we don't know what that would look like.
It's a good example of how complex these systems are. Once you unravel the food web, it's not a single variable problem anymore. It's a nest of problems.
But from that area, over 90% of the kelp forests have been lost since 2015.
Do I recall correctly from my childhood that your gonads are a Japanese delicacy?
I don't know if it's
I
the
think it's a
purples.
different
I think that's the red and the green.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was unclear. That's all.
Yeah.
So is
Yeah.
that otter?
The otter was very helpful in controlling some of these, and this is not just an otter story. Though it's not just the loss of otters, but that's one part of the story. Yeah. When you really have systemic change in which a warming, high CO2 ocean sets the table for bacterial and viral invasions that didn't occur in the past and that wipe out the sea stars, for example. And I mean, it's link after link after link in a chain that has lived in a thermally and chemically stable environment for millions and millions of years. The world we know in the ocean grew up in a stable world, but it ain't the 1950s anymore. That's that stable home that they knew, and that we only
It's
fantasize
changing
about.
at unprecedented rates.
Yeah, that's right. So we're going to get a hard shake, and the question is whether we respond to it quickly enough to keep some of what we love.
And there will be winners, but unfortunately, so far, it doesn't look like we'll like those winners much. For example, jellyfish thrive very well in hot, acidic waters. And some of the surveys that were done recently, where they found many of these southern fish, in northern waters where they shouldn't have been. They also found many of these things called pyrosomes that are jellyfish-like copepods just covering the necks.
There's a question there, and then you're next. And then you're the third after that. All right, okay.
Our local U.S. representative, Suzanne Bonaducci, serves on a House committee in Washington that has to do with the oceans. I can't think of the name of the committee right now. I'm wondering if your research, your information is feeding as well into Washington, D.C.
They have in the past. We're not doing very much in DC in the last decade. It's been, as you may have noticed, a helpless morass. And we pretty much left
Not
it
to mince words.
Yeah, but we left it to other organizations that are better equipped to wade around in that morass and occasionally get something useful done. After a few years of really working hard and well in the late 2000s, getting a lot of information into the system, we just realized that, and some of the fishermen whose pictures you saw when we did that work, but for us, it was, we felt that the ball really shifted. States are the civic laboratories. States are where problems are solved in novel ways, and then the feds look at them and learn, and sometimes emulate. So it's still the case, sadly, that the feds are not, on Capitol Hill anyway, going to be doing much for a little while. We'll see, maybe next year. Yes, we're not done with it. This will change. There will come a time. And there are a lot of interesting ideas brewing. And it's a good time to start paying attention again.
Well, I was just going to ask a little bit more about the seafood working group. It sounds like that might be around policy examination or analysis. Are there other aspects, like are any of the folks involved in your network doing any of the monitoring or research relevant to seafood impacts, or is it mostly a policy-focused working group?
It's primarily focused on policy. The research dimension feeds into it. People are learning about those things in the group. There is a new dimension entering into it. I mentioned carbon removal. People are very interested in that. I think there's a lot of enterprising people on the waterfront who might want to be part of that. That's a big discussion for another time, but it's going to be huge. I mean, if only 10 billion tons is removed annually and put into some form of, mineral forming the ocean or turned into products, and they extract the hydrogen and combine it and make renewable fuel that's carbon neutral. If only 10 billion tons of CO2 goes there, that's smaller than we think it'll end up being. But that is 100 times bigger than the world's seafood catch. This is a transformative change in the way.
The footprint.
It's
of
the entire volume of the catch. The world's volume of seafood catch is under 100 million tons. If we're going to be doing things that put 2 billion tons into the ocean, it's more than 100 times greater. And what that tells you is there's going to be activity in coastal communities doing this. It's going to be an economic engine. It's going to change life on the coast if it happens. And no one's ready for this. We don't know how to manage it yet. We better figure it out. It's going to happen. There's a whole lot of things that have to be done to make sure it happens right. Because wrong is unacceptable for this. There's real consequences if this goes wrong. But if it goes right, it could be really a good thing. That's an example of one of the activities that the working group will have a lot to say about. It's early yet, but it won't be early for long. This is moving fast. Other remarks, questions?
Did we have one over here? Yeah, it's already.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here.
Well, I want to thank you for coming back every year. I mean,